Hi, I'm Randy Rempel, and welcome to this 10 minutes on Tenant Migration webcast focused on SharePoint Online migration. In this short webcast, we are going to cover why Microsoft SharePoint Online migrations are hard. I'll cover topics like how much content to migrate, modernize now or later, permissions and metadata, customizations, and bandwidth and throttling. Most people know that SharePoint was launched in 2001 as a document management and storage system. Back in 2012, SharePoint appeared online. It's evolved quite a bit since then, and we've seen a huge growth in content online as organizations moved from on-premise to online. The growth continued faster as more users went online because of the recent pandemic. So why is having so much content a problem to migrate? Well, we all know the basic structure of SharePoint Online is hubs, site collections, subsites, and lots of lists and document libraries. And some organizations can have hundreds of subsites in a single site collection. These structures and objects must be created before the content migrations start to migrate to the target tenant. One of the big problems is that these are cross-referenced between lists in different parts of these structures. Organizations can also end up with hundreds to thousands of lists and libraries in their SharePoint Online environment. Even more challenging than this is that some of these lists and libraries can grow to contain hundreds of thousands of items. While it's possible for SPO to support a list or library of this size, it is a huge challenge to migrate it over to a new target all at once. Typically, users add this content slowly over months or years, but now we want to migrate it in a very short time period. This migration places a huge load on the SQL Server running in the back end of SPO. Another issue is that we see is source sites that already exist on the target. Do you merge content or create a new site? Who decides? Where do you create the new site if that is the decision? So does everything have to be migrated? Probably not, except for legal or regulatory requirements. So I recommend reviewing the content. Has it been used recently? Is it going to be used in the future? Maybe it can be archived. Is there business value or criticality? Is it required for a merger, divestiture, or acquisition? Does someone claim ownership of that content and wants it moved? This will help you decide on whether or not to move all the content. Modernizing your SharePoint sites became a big topic recently. There are benefits and costs to switching to modern sites, and it seems like a migration provides you with a good decision point about whether to modernize or not. So what does modernization do? Let me talk through 5 technical points here. It forces a site to appear as a modern site. It cannot appear as a classic site anymore. It creates modern versions of classic pages using the page transformation framework. Now this is really cool, but also quite complicated since there are significant differences between classic and modern page models. This is where many migrations stumble, thinking that the transformation script automatically modernizes pages. It doesn't. There's some configuration required, especially for more complex pages. It replaces classic themes with modern tenant-controlled themes, so no more custom master page definitions or alternate CSS. It will connect a site collection to a M365 group, creating a new group if necessary. We like to call this groupify, and it's optional. Finally, you can teamify the SharePoint site. This sounds so cool, but it really means that a new MS team is created with the M365 group. Okay, I'm done with the technical points, and I scored big points for saying groupify and teamify. So I do see a lot of organizations updating their classic team sites to modern team sites. I see a lot of challenges appear when updating from publishing sites to communication sites. It's even more challenging when the classic site template you are using does not seem to have a matching modern site template. You might just lose something along the way. So please keep in mind that these are some fundamental changes and you should plan for them. Next to migrating all of the content, users want to ensure that all of the permissions and metadata are migrated correctly. Most organizations expect that everyone moving to the target tenant must have the same access as they did on the source. But it's not always so easy. Migrations have to consider matching users from source to target, not easy when there are users with almost the same names. Configuring broken inheritance with sites, dependencies on AD groups when referenced in SharePoint groups, replacing shared permissions with direct permissions. Here's an interesting problem. What if your source and target tenants have different default languages? You may want to use the default groups used in the target tenant, even though the group names won't match the default group names on the source. And any custom SharePoint groups on the source will likely retain their naming on the target. They just won't look like they are named correctly. And copying metadata is often a key requirement. But migrating metadata can slow down a migration, so you really need to consider if copying metadata is absolutely required in every instance. One of the challenges is copying the original username, but the user left the organization a long time ago, or they're not one of the users being migrated. Do you still want their name to appear? And getting the date values set correctly should not really be an issue anymore, but we do see some users run into problems with date values based on where the source data is and where the migration is being run from. Sometimes problems appear with configurations and crossing multiple regions, and usually this can be resolved with some testing in advance. Customizations are becoming a bigger issue these days. It's usually for one of the following reasons. Classic site templates were used on the source and they want to modernize and have the same user experience. This really means a restriction of what you could previously customize. Customized info path forms were used on the source tenant and they need to be modified to work on the target tenant. Third-party forms or workflows were used on the source and now it's time to switch to the forms and flows available in the Power Platform. I'm going to mention OneNote here too. We see some organizations using OneNote very heavily. And the problem is OneNote is not like Word or Excel. It's like a mini application and has changed substantially with every release. I highly recommend that everyone test their OneNotes during migrations. So these issues may require analysis beforehand to decide on what needs to be done. These cannot be automatically converted with some tool. They likely require hands-on development to customize or recreate a solution. Other components like views and navigation, like quick links, might be able to be migrated over easily. But remember when I briefly mentioned cross-dependencies earlier? Views and navigation items may have dependencies on other content being migrated first. And you may end up with cross-dependencies that make it difficult or impossible to recreate these elements automatically. You may have to come back and create these later. And sometimes they are so complex that you need a developer to create them properly. You just can't take it for granted that these customizations will migrate easily. You have to find them, review them, and decide on the best way to move them from the source to the target successfully. Migration bandwidth and throttling is one of my favorite topics, but let's be clear, it's not everyone's favorite. Most people hear throttling and they respond with fear and dread, so let's talk through this. One of the most common questions that I'm asked about is how fast can we migrate? Or I'm asked to give the fastest throughput numbers. But what does this really mean? Microsoft provides guidance on how their migration API handles different types of content and the resulting throughput. Basically, Microsoft is providing the limitations on their migration API. Your migrations live within these limitations. There's no secret path around this. So here's the first part that no one likes. When you exceed a limitation, you are throttled. And the second part is throttling is never turned off by Microsoft. So what can you do? Well, review your content and decide on what really needs to be migrated. What can be left behind or archived? Do you need every version? Do you need to set all permissions at the item level? Do you need all your metadata? You need to balance the content that you need with the migration throughput performance. Also, not everyone realizes that throughput limitations exist elsewhere. For example, there are limitations on how many planner tasks and private chat migrations can be created. So you can experience throttling here too. Just remember that these limitations ensure that your tenant will remain stable for your users to continue using. So it's not all bad, just a challenge to hit your migration targets. So thank you for joining me today to take a look at some of these Microsoft SharePoint Online migration topics. If you're interested in trying Quest on Demand migration, please download the free 30-day trial. And if you found this helpful, watch our other 10 minutes on Tenant Migration webcast shown here.